The chandelier in the Werner Tower lobby cost more than most people's houses, and I know this because my mother told me so the first week I worked there. In the tone of someone warning a child away from a hot stove. "Don't look up at it too long," she said. "Things that beautiful aren't for looking at. They're for walking past." I walked past it every morning at 5:45, pushing a cart with a mop bucket that squeaked on the left wheel no matter how much oil I put on it. And I never once let myself look up for more than a second, not because my mother told me not to, because I knew exactly what kind of man owned that chandelier, and men like that didn't notice boys like me unless we'd done something wrong. My name is Daniel Gill. I was 22 years old that autumn, an omega with no pedigree, no family name worth mentioning, and a night shift cleaning job at the largest financial building in the city. I mopped floors that reflected the moon through 40-foot windows. I dusted the leaves of plants that cost more to maintain than my monthly rent. I existed for 8 hours a night in a world that was never built to notice me, and I had made peace with that. More than peace, really. I'd built a whole life around being unnoticed. It felt safe. Invisible things don't get hurt. I'd heard of Eric Werner, the way everyone in the building had heard of him. In fragments, in gossip traded over break room coffee, in headlines my coworkers sometimes showed me on their phones. The heir to Werner Holdings. 28 years old. An alpha who had, according to the tabloids, rejected 11 different omegas his family had paraded in front of him over the past 3 years. 11. The number had become a kind of joke among the cleaning staff. We used to guess what would be wrong with the 12th. "Too short," my coworker Priya said once, mopping beside me on the 30th floor. Or too tall, or laughed wrong. I heard he turned one down because she wore the wrong perfume. "Maybe he just doesn't want to be told who to love," I said. And Priya laughed like I'd said something naive, which, looking back, I probably had. I never expected to meet him. Executives didn't ride the service elevator. They didn't notice the cart in the corner of the lobby at midnight, didn't clock the boy in the gray uniform refilling the hand soap in the executive washroom. I was furniture. I was supposed to be furniture. That was the whole design of the job. To be so unremarkable that wealthy people could go on pretending their floors cleaned themselves. It was a Thursday in October when that stopped being true, though I didn't know yet that it would matter, that I'd remember the exact slant of the light through the lobby windows for the rest of my life. I was on my knees behind the reception desk, untangling a knot of phone cables that someone in IT had apparently given up on, when I heard the elevator chime. It was nearly 11 at night. No one came down at 11 except security and, occasionally, the cleaning supervisor doing rounds. I didn't look up. I'd learned not to look up. "You're not supposed to be back there." The voice was low, even, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised because it had never once needed to ask twice for anything. I sat back on my heels and looked up anyway, because something in the tone made it clear that not looking up would be its own kind of rudeness. He was taller than I expected. I'd seen his photo in the elevator bank, the official corporate headshot with the too symmetrical lighting, but photos hadn't captured the particular stillness of him, the way he stood like a man who had never once needed to fidget. Dark hair, slightly mussed, like he'd been running his hands through it. A suit that probably cost what I made in 3 months. The jacket gone, sleeves rolled to the forearm. Eric Werner. I knew it instantly, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color. "Sorry," I said, scrambling to my feet, the tangle of cables still looped around one hand. "IT left these. I was just... I'll come back." "No." He said it quickly, almost too quickly, like the word had escaped before he'd decided to use it. "You're fine." I didn't mean, I just wasn't expecting anyone. "I work nights," I said, which was obvious, given the uniform, given the mop bucket 6 feet away with its one squeaking wheel. I felt suddenly very aware of how I must look to him. The gray polyester, the rubber gloves tucked into my back pocket, the hair I hadn't bothered to brush since my shift started. He didn't look at any of that. That was the thing I noticed, even then, even before I let myself notice anything else about him. He looked at my face the way you'd look at someone you were trying to place from another life. like he was searching for something. "What's your name?" No one asked that. In 11 months of working in that building, not one executive had asked my name. I was cleaning staff, capital letters, a category rather than a person. I almost didn't answer, out of sheer reflexive disbelief. "Daniel," I said. "Faniel Gill." "Eric," he said. And I almost laughed because of course I knew, because his name was etched into the lobby's donor wall and printed on the side of the building 3 blocks over. But there was something disarming about the way he said it, like an introduction between equals, like he hadn't just assumed I already knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. "I know," I said, "Mr. Werner." Something in his face shifted at that, a small flicker, almost disappointment, though I couldn't have said why a stranger's recognition of his own name would disappoint him. "Eric's fine," he said. "It's late. You're working alone?" "Priya's on 4. I'm lobby and the executive floor tonight." I gestured vaguely at the cables, an excuse to look away from him, because his eyes had a way of asking questions I didn't know how to answer. I should finish this. Of course. He didn't move. I waited for him to walk toward the doors, toward whatever car was surely waiting outside, toward a night that had nothing to do with cable management behind a reception desk. He stayed exactly where he was. Does it ever get lonely? Working nights? It was such an odd question from a man I'd exchanged perhaps 40 words with, that I actually looked back up at him, trying to read whether it was pity or genuine curiosity. His face gave nothing away except that same searching quality, like he was cataloging something about me he hadn't expected to find. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Mostly it's quiet. I don't mind quiet." "I think I'd mind it," he said. "I think I'd mind it a great deal." "Maybe how years." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. And after a moment, he nodded once, like he'd concluded some private negotiation with himself, and walked toward the doors. He paused with his hand on the brass push bar. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, mister." I caught myself. "Good night, Eric." He smiled then, just barely, just enough that I felt it land somewhere underneath my sternum, and then he was gone out into the cold, and I was alone with a tangle of cables and a strange, unfamiliar warmth that I told myself very firmly meant absolutely nothing. I didn't expect to see him again. Men like Eric Werner moved through buildings like weather systems. They passed over you once, dramatically, and then they were gone, off to wherever weather goes when it isn't raining on you anymore. I went back to my routine. I mopped the lobby. I dusted the leaves. I rode the service elevator up to the 40th floor and emptied the wastebaskets of people who would never know my name. And for 3 nights I told myself that the strange encounter with the CEO's heir had been exactly that, strange, singular, over. He was in the lobby again on the 4th night. This time, he wasn't in a suit. He wore a dark sweater and jeans, which on anyone else might have read as an attempt at disguise, except that even dressed down, Eric Werner carried himself like a man who had never once needed to disappear into a crowd. He was sitting on the leather bench by the window when I came down from the 8th floor with my cart, and he stood when he saw me, like I was someone worth standing for. "I had a meeting that ran late," he said, before I could ask, before I could even fully process that he was there at all. "I thought I don't know, I thought I might see you." "You came down here to see if I'd be mopping the floor?" When you put it that way, it sounds significantly less reasonable than it felt in my head. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, which startled me more than anything else he'd said or done. Men with his kind of power didn't usually allow themselves to look embarrassed in front of people like me. "I wanted to talk to you again. Is that strange?" "A little," I said honestly, because something about him made honesty feel safer than performance. "You don't know me. I'd like to." 3 words, said plainly, without any of the practiced charm I'd have expected from a man whose face had been in society pages since he was old enough to wear a tuxedo. I felt the back of my neck go warm, felt my pulse do something complicated and unwelcome, and I reminded myself sharply that I was an unmated omega standing in an empty lobby at midnight with an alpha who had rejected 11 women his family had hand-picked for him, and that nothing about this situation was as simple as it might feel in the moment. "I have work to do," I said, which was true, and also a kind of shield. Can I help? I actually laughed at that, a short surprise sound that escaped before I could stop it. You want to help me mop? I want to talk to you while you mop. I'm not entirely useless. I could carry the bucket. The bucket has a squeaky wheel. It's basically self-propelled. Then I'll walk beside the squeaky bucket and provide moral support. I shouldn't have let him. I knew that even as I was pushing the cart toward the east wing and he was falling into step beside me, hands in his pockets, asking me questions like he had nowhere else in the entire world he needed to be. Where was I from? How long had I worked here? What did I do when I wasn't here, on the rare nights I had off? I answered some of it honestly, that I'd grown up 2 districts over, that I'd been at this job 11 months, that on my nights off, I mostly read, mostly slept. Mostly tried to save enough money to eventually go back to school for something, though I hadn't decided what yet. I didn't ask him much in return, not that first night of his unexpected visit. I didn't need to. I already knew the broad shape of his life from headlines and breakroom gossip, the dynasty, the expectations, the parade of omegas his family had introduced him to like items on a menu. What I didn't know, what surprised me as the night went on, was how tired he sounded whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near his own life. Not bored. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Can I ask you something? I said, somewhere around 1 in the morning, as I wiped down the glass of the directory board near the elevators. And you don't have to answer. You can ask me anything. Why do you reject them, the omegas your family picked? I expected him to deflect, the way powerful people usually deflected questions that got too close to the parts of themselves they kept curated for public consumption. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, leaning against the wall beside the directory board, watching me work. Because none of them wanted me, he said finally. They wanted what I represent. The company, the name, a version of security that has nothing to do with who I actually am as a person. He paused. I don't think any of them had ever spoken to me for longer than 10 minutes before deciding they'd marry me. I don't think they needed to. The decision had already been made for them, the way it had been made for me. I just kept saying no until it stopped being worth the fight. That sounds lonely. It was. He looked at me then, steady, unguarded, in a way I hadn't expected from someone whose face I'd seen plastered across financial publications. It still is, mostly, except for the last 4 nights. I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't trust myself to have an answer for that. So I kept wiping the already clean glass of the directory board until he mercifully changed the subject to something safer, a museum exhibit he'd seen recently, a stray cat he'd been feeding outside his apartment that refused to let him get within 10 feet of it. By the time he finally said goodnight, the sky outside had gone the particular gray-blue of an hour before dawn, and I realized I'd spent almost 3 hours talking to Eric Werner and hadn't once felt like furniture. That should have worried me more than it did. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Within 2 weeks, it had become something I didn't examine too closely. An arrangement unspoken where Eric would find some excuse, a late meeting, an early start, a reason to be in the building at the exact hours I was working, and we would talk while I cleaned his presence, becoming as familiar to my nights as the squeak of the cart's left wheel. My coworkers noticed before I let myself admit anything was happening. Priya cornered me in the break room one night, eyebrows raised, arms crossed, the universal posture of someone who has gossip and intends to extract a confession. The Werner heir, she said. Walking the East Wing with you at 1 in the morning, twice this week. He's lonely, I said, which was true, and also, I realized as I said it, sounded like a defense, which meant I had already decided I needed one. Daniel. She said my name like a warning. You know what happens to omegas who get tangled up with men like that. He's not going to marry the cleaning staff. His family will never allow it. You'll be a story people tell at parties. The boy who mopped the Werner lobby and thought it meant something. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to tell her that Eric didn't look at me the way the men in those cautionary stories looked at people, like consumables, like temporary indulgences before the real, serious business of dynasty continued. But I didn't have the language yet for what was actually happening between us, because what was actually happening between us hadn't fully happened yet. We talked. That was all. We talked, and somewhere in the talking, I had started counting the hours until my shift began the way I used to count the hours until it ended. It's not like that, I told her, and I almost believed it. There was a night in late October, before any of it had a name yet, when I almost talked myself out of the whole thing. I remember it specifically because it was the first time he brought me something. Nothing extravagant, just a paper bag of pastries from a bakery near his office, still warm, like he'd timed his errands around my break. I stood there holding the bag, feeling the heat of it through the paper, and felt a wave of something close to panic. "You can't keep doing this," I told him, setting the bag down on the reception desk without opening it. He went very still, the way people do when they sense a conversation has turned somewhere they didn't expect. "Doing what?" "Bringing me things. Standing here at midnight like you don't have an entire life waiting for you somewhere else." I crossed my arms, more to keep my hands from shaking than out of any real anger. "I've read about your family, Eric. I know what they expect from you. I'm not going to be the reason you disappoint them, and then in 6 months you go marry whoever they actually pick, and I'm just the boy who mopped your floor and got confused about what was happening." He didn't argue right away. That was the thing about him I hadn't expected. He never rushed to defend himself, never reached for the easy reassurance. He just looked at me for a long moment, like he was choosing his words the way you'd choose footing on uncertain ground. "I can't promise you my family will ever fully accept this," he said finally. "I won't lie to you and pretend that's a guarantee I can make. But I can promise you that I'm not here because I'm confused or bored or slumming some kind of rebellion against my grandmother. I'm here because for the first time in my life, I look forward to something that has nothing to do with the company. I look forward to you. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's not something I'm willing to just hand back because it might be complicated." "Complicated is generous," I said, though some of the fight had already gone out of my voice. "Then let it be complicated," he said. "I'd rather have something complicated and real than something simple and hollow. I've had simple and hollow for 3 years. 11 times, in fact." A small, rueful smile. "I know the math on this isn't easy. I know what it looks like from outside. The air and the cleaner. Like something out of a novel someone would roll their eyes at. But I'm not interested in how it looks. I'm interested in how it feels, and how it feels is the first honest thing in my life in longer than I can remember." I picked the pastry bag back up, if only to give my hands something to do besides reach for him. "If I let you keep doing this," I said, "you have to actually let me feed myself sometimes. I don't need rescuing, Eric. I've been taking care of myself a long time." "Understood," he said, entirely too solemnly for someone who, I would later learn, had absolutely no intention of actually stopping. Strictly equal partnership. "Pastries optional." "Pastries allowed," I corrected, "occasionally, under protest." "Under protest." "Under protest." He agreed, and there was something in the way he said it, light and teasing and warm all at once, that told me the panic I'd been holding onto all night had already started to lose its grip, replaced by something far more dangerous and far more honest. The quiet, creeping certainty that I wanted this. Whatever shape it eventually took more than I wanted, the safety of staying invisible. It became official, became something neither of us could pretend was casual anymore on a Tuesday in November, the kind of night where the city outside the windows looked like it had been carved from ice. And the heating in the lobby had gone temperamental, leaving the whole space colder than it should have been. I was wearing a sweater under my uniform shirt hands, chapped from the industrial cleaner, when Eric arrived, not in a suit, not in his usual dressed-down disguise, but in a heavy coat that looked entirely impractical for a man who was supposedly just passing through on his way to a late meeting. "You don't have a meeting tonight," I said, before he could offer whatever excuse he'd prepared. He had the decency to look sheepish. "No, I don't." "So why are you here?" "Because I wanted to see you, and I've apparently exhausted my supply of plausible work-related reasons to be in this building at midnight." He said it lightly, but there was something underneath the lightness, something that made my chest go tight. "I could invent a new one if it would make this easier for you." A water main emergency. A surprise audit. You don't need an excuse, I said, and the words came out quieter than I meant them to, more honest than I'd planned. I like that you come. The lobby was empty except for us. The chandelier my mother had warned me about caught the cold light from outside and scattered it across the marble floor in fractured pieces, and Eric crossed the space between us slowly. The way you'd approach something you were afraid of, frightening away. Daniel, he said, and my name in his mouth had become, over these 3 weeks, a sound I'd started to crave without admitting it to myself. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm not saying it because of who my family is, or what they expect, or any of the reasons that have governed every other decision in my life. I'm saying it because it's true. I set down the cloth I'd been holding. My hands had started shaking, not from the cold. I think about you constantly, he said. I think about you when I'm in meetings I should be paying attention to. I think about you when I'm supposed to be reviewing contracts. I came down here the first night because I told myself I was curious about the person who'd looked at me like I was just a man, not an empire. And I kept coming back because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, curiosity turned into something I don't have a tidy word for. I don't want to court you the way my family wants me to court someone. I don't want a contract, a negotiation, a merger dressed up as a marriage. I want. He stopped, like even he, a man who had spent his whole life learning to speak in boardrooms, had run out of practiced language. I want this, whatever this is, I want it to be real. I should have said something measured. I should have thought about Priya's warning, about the 11 Omegas before me, about the impossible gap between a cleaning supervisor's nephew and the heir to Werner Holdings. Instead, I said the only true thing in my chest. I want it too. I've wanted it since the cables. He laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him, and the sound of it undid something in me that I'd kept very carefully wound tight for 22 years. He reached out, slow, giving me every opportunity to step back, and rested his palm against the side of my face, his thumb brushing along my cheekbone like he was trying to memorize the shape of it. Can I kiss you? He asked, and the question itself, the asking instead of assuming, was somehow more disarming than anything else he'd said all night. Yes, I said, and he closed the distance, and his mouth against mine was warm despite the cold lobby air. Careful at first, and then less careful when I made a small sound against his lips and gripped the front of his coat to pull him closer. He tasted faintly of coffee, and something underneath that I would later learn was simply him, the particular chemistry of his skin that my body had apparently already decided it wanted to know intimately. When we finally broke apart, his forehead resting against mine, both of us breathing harder than the moment probably warranted, I felt the floor tilt slightly under me, not from dizziness, but from the sheer scale of what had just shifted. I should finish my shift, I said, voice unsteady, and he laughed again, softer this time, and pressed one more kiss to my forehead before stepping back. I'll walk you through it, if that's allowed. Nothing about tonight has been allowed, I said, and he grinned the most unguarded expression I'd seen on him yet, and fell into step beside me as I pushed the cart toward the east wing. The squeaky wheel marking time like a clock, counting down to something I didn't yet have a name for. The weeks that followed were the happiest of my life, and I say that with the full weight of someone who has lived enough years now to know what happiness actually costs. We kept it quiet at first. Eric's idea, not because he was ashamed he made that explicit more than once, but because he wanted time, real time uncomplicated by his family's machinery, before the world found out and started trying to shape what we were into, something it could use. He started picking me up after my shift in a car that wasn't his usual sleek black sedan, but something plainer, less recognizable, and we'd drive to a diner 2 districts over that stayed open all night. The kind of place with sticky vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous decade. And we'd eat eggs at 4 in the morning and talk about everything that had nothing to do with Werner Holdings. His favorite color, which was an unglamorous shade of olive green he'd loved since childhood and had never told anyone because it didn't fit the image his family preferred. My half-finished plans to study architecture, a dream I'd shelved when my father got sick and the medical bills ate through whatever savings might have funded it. He listened to that story with a stillness that made me believe, for the first time in years, that someone actually wanted to carry part of the weight of it with me. I could help, he said, the first time I told him, careful, not pushing. I don't want your money, Eric. I know. That's not. He'd reached across the table and taken my hand, the gesture so natural between us by then that I almost didn't register how significant it was. An alpha's hand wrapped around an omega's in a public diner booth. No pretense, no performance for anyone watching. I don't mean it as a transaction. I mean, I want to be someone in your life who shows up when things are hard. That's all. You can say no. I didn't say no, not in the end, though it took 3 more conversations and one moment where I nearly walked out of the diner entirely, overwhelmed by the strange vertigo of being offered something I'd spent my whole life learning not to want. There was a particular night, a week or so after that first offer, where I finally told him the rest of it, the parts I'd left out before, the parts that were harder to say out loud. My father didn't just get sick, I told him, staring down at the chipped rim of my coffee mug rather than at his face. He got sick, and the bill started piling up, and my mother worked 2 jobs trying to keep the lights on, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped being the kid who got to dream about architecture and became the kid who needed to bring in a paycheck. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand why it's hard for me to take anything from anyone. Taking things means owing things. Owing things means people get to decide what you are to them. I don't want you to owe me anything, he said quietly. I want you to have the thing you wanted before the world took it away from you. That's different from owing, Danielle. That's just wanting good things for someone you love without expecting anything back for it. You don't know yet if you love me, I said, though even as I said it, some treacherous part of me hoped he'd argue. I think I might, he said, simply, like it was a fact he'd only just confirmed for himself and was still getting used to the shape of it. I think I might be getting there faster than either of us expected. I didn't answer that directly. I just turned my hand over under his on the table, palm to palm, and let that be the answer instead, and he seemed to understand it exactly the way I meant it. I didn't say no, in the end, to the tuition assistance he eventually convinced me to accept. Not to the quiet, persistent way he started showing up in every corner of my life that had previously belonged only to me. He met me after night classes I started taking that spring, sitting in the back of public lecture halls in a baseball cap and unremarkable jacket, looking more like a graduate student than the heir to a financial empire. He learned the names of my coworkers. Priya, and old Marcus from security, and a building manager whose birthday he somehow remembered and sent flowers for. A gesture so far outside what I expected from a man of his standing that it nearly undid me when I found out. Priya, for her part, took longer to come around than anyone else. She watched Eric from across the break room with the particular suspicion of someone who had seen enough cautionary tales to distrust a happy ending on principle. And for weeks she said very little to him beyond polite, clipped greetings. It was Eric who finally won her over, not with charm, which I think she would have resented, but with consistency, showing up on the nights he said he would, remembering the small details I'd mentioned offhand about her life, asking after her daughter's school recital without being prompted to. He's annoyingly sincere, she told me one night, grudging watching him help old Marcus carry a delivery of bottled water from the loading dock without being asked, his sleeves rolled up. No awareness at all that the heir to Werner Holdings wasn't supposed to be lifting boxes at 1 in the morning. I was hoping he'd turn out to be exactly as hollow as the tabloids made him sound. Would have made this so much simpler to worry about. Sorry to disappoint, I said, and she rolled her eyes, but there was real warmth underneath it, and I understood that I'd just been given something close to her blessing, which mattered to me more than I let on. His scent changed around me too, in the way alphas' scents shift around omegas they're bonding to, something I'd read about but never experienced. A warm undertone, like cedar, and something sweeter underneath that I found myself seeking out without meaning. To leaning into him on the rare quiet nights we had together, my nose against his throat, breathing him in like it was a kind of medicine. He told me once, lying tangled together on the worn couch in my small apartment, that my scent had started doing something similar to him. That omegas weren't supposed to smell like safety. Weren't supposed to smell like the only place in his life that didn't come with conditions, but that mine did, and he didn't know what to do with how much that terrified and comforted him in equal measure. My family is going to find out eventually, he said one night, his fingers tracing slow, idle patterns against my shoulder. I'd rather they hear it from me. Are you scared? Yes. He said it without hesitation, which somehow made it less frightening to hear. Not of losing the company. I don't care about the company the way they think I should. I'm scared of what they'll do to you. They've spent 3 years trying to engineer my marriage into something that benefits the holding company's portfolio. You're not on anyone's spreadsheet, Daniel. That's going to make you a problem to them before they ever bother to see you as a person. I pressed closer to him, my cheek against his chest, listening to the steady drum of his heartbeat. I'm not afraid of your family. You should be a little afraid of my family. Fine, I said. I'm a little afraid of your family. I'm more afraid of losing you. He went quiet at that, and I felt his arms tighten around me, and neither of us said anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. We both already knew that the next part of this story wasn't going to be easy. We'd both been building toward it without naming it, the way you build toward a storm you can see gathering on the horizon even while the sun is still out. The Werner family found out 3 months after that first night in the lobby, and they found out the way I suppose families like that always find out things. Not from Eric's confession, which he'd been quietly planning, gathering courage for, but from a photograph. A tabloid photographer had caught us outside the diner, Eric's hand resting at the small of my back as we walked to his car. An image unremarkable in itself, except for who one of the people in it happened to be. By morning, it was everywhere. The heir to Werner Holdings photographed in unmistakable intimacy with an unidentified young man in cleaning staff attire. The uniform visible in the corner of the frame where I hadn't yet changed out of my work clothes. Eric called me before I'd even seen the photo myself, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him. Don't go to work tonight. I need to handle this first. Eric, I have a shift. Daniil, please. There was something in his voice that stopped me cold, something close to fear, though I didn't yet understand what specifically had frightened him. My grandmother has already called 3 times. I need to get to the building before. Just trust me, please. I trusted him. I stayed home, scrolling through the photo and the swarm of comments beneath it on my phone with a sick, sinking feeling, watching strangers speculate about my life with a casual cruelty that made my hands shake. Some of the comments were almost kind, romantic even. People delighted by the idea of an heir falling for someone outside his world. Most were not. Gold digger, fortune hunter. A boy who mops floors thinking he can mop his way into a fortune. I read each one like a small stone being placed on my chest until I couldn't breathe properly, until I put the phone face down on my kitchen table and sat in the silence of my apartment feeling, for the first time since that night, with the tangled cables exactly as small as the world had always told me I was. Eric showed up at my door at 6 that evening, still in the same suit he must have worn into whatever meeting had consumed his entire day, exhaustion carved into his face in a way I'd never seen before. My grandmother wants to meet you, he said, before I could even ask how the day had gone. Tomorrow, at the house. That sounds like a summons, not an invitation. It is a summons. He sat heavily on my couch, dragging a hand down his face. I told them everything today. Who you are, what you mean to me. I told them I'm not interested in any further introductions, that I've found who I want, and that if the company's board has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly instead of trying to manufacture a scandal out of a photograph. And what did they say? My father said very little, which is its own kind of answer with him. My grandmother said she wants to meet you before she decides what she thinks. He looked up at me, something raw and unguarded in his expression. I won't make you go if you don't want to. I can fight this without putting you in a room with her, but I think I think if there's any chance of them eventually accepting this, accepting us, it starts with her. She's the one who actually runs things, whatever the org chart says. I thought about Priya's warning in the break room weeks ago. I thought about my mother telling me not to look up at the chandelier too long, that beautiful things were for walking past, not for reaching toward. I thought about the comments still glowing on my phone screen in the next room, calling me things I knew weren't true, but that still found their way under my skin like splinters. And then I thought about Eric's hand finding mine across a diner table, about him learning my coworkers' names, about the particular quiet way he'd listened when I told him about my father's illness, about 3 months of a happiness so total it had started to feel like the only honest thing in my entire life. "I'll go," I said. "I'm not going to let a photograph decide what we are." He crossed the room and pulled me against him, his face buried in my hair, and I felt him breathe out, long and shaking, like he'd been holding that breath since the moment he saw the photo that morning. "I love you," he said, quiet, into my hair, the words arriving without ceremony, without the kind of grand declaration the tabloids would have wanted. Just true and simple and exactly when I needed to hear it. I should have said it before now. "I love you, Daniel. Whatever happens tomorrow, that doesn't change." "I love you too," I said, and meant it with my whole chest, and for one night at least, that was enough to hold the rest of the world at bay. The board meeting happened the morning after the photograph broke, and Eric told me about it later, piece by piece over several conversations. Like he needed to process it in installments before he could hand the whole of it to me at once. Apparently, 3 separate board members had used the word liability within the first 10 minutes. One had gone so far as to suggest a formal statement distancing the company from personal matters of no relevance to shareholders, language that made my stomach turn when Eric repeated it to me, even secondhand, even months later. "I told them," Eric said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table 2 nights after the photo broke. His tie loosened, his voice still carrying the rawness of a day spent defending something he shouldn't have had to defend, that if anyone on that board wanted to discuss my personal life as though it were a line item, they were welcome to put it in writing, and I would forward it directly to every business journalist who'd been hounding the building all week. I told them I built nothing about this company's recent growth on the strength of who I was dating, and I wasn't going to let them pretend my personal happiness was suddenly relevant to quarterly projections. And what did they say to that? Mostly, they went quiet. A small, tired smile. My father didn't say much of anything, which, from him, is either very good or very bad, and I genuinely couldn't tell you which. My grandmother just watched the whole thing happen and didn't intervene once, which I've learned over the years usually means she's already decided something and is waiting to see who proves themselves before she says so out loud. That's not very comforting. No, he agreed, it isn't. But I'd rather have her honest assessment than a performance of acceptance that evaporates the first time it's inconvenient. He reached across the table, his thumb tracing slow circles against the back of my hand, a gesture that had become as familiar to me as breathing. "I need you to know that whatever the board decides, whatever my family decides, it doesn't change what I've already decided. I'm not interested in a version of my life that doesn't have you in it. If that costs me the company eventually, I'll survive it. I won't survive losing you to a fight I was too cowardly to have." I thought about all the headlines I'd avoided reading that day, the speculation, the casual cruelty of strangers deciding who I was based on a photograph and a uniform visible in one corner of the frame. I thought about how easy it would have been in another version of this story for him to have asked me to disappear for a while, to wait quietly out of sight until the controversy faded. The way I suspected some of his family might have preferred, he never once asked me to disappear. That, more than anything else, was what convinced me to walk through his grandmother's front door 2 days later instead of running from it. The Werner estate was exactly as intimidating as I'd imagined and somehow still managed to surprise me. Gates that required 3 separate confirmations before opening a driveway longer than the entire block I'd grown up on. A house that looked less like a home and more like an institution built to remind visitors of their relative smallness. I wore the nicest clothes I owned, a button-down shirt Eric had quietly suggested I might want for the occasion. And I'd never in my life felt so aware of every seam and stitch on my body as I did walking up those front steps with Eric's hand steady at the small of my back. Eric's grandmother received us in a sitting room that overlooked a garden too manicured to look real. She was smaller than I expected, white-haired, sharp-eyed in a way that made me understand immediately how this woman had built and held an empire across decades of an industry that chewed up people far more powerful than me. She didn't stand when we entered. She simply watched us cross the room, her gaze moving over me with an assessment so thorough I felt unclothed by it. "So," she said, once we were seated, once tea had been poured by a staff member who avoided meeting my eyes the way I used to avoid meeting the eyes of executives in the Werner lobby. "You're the young man who's caused such a stir." "Daniel Gill," I said, and offered my hand, because I'd decided on the drive over that I would not shrink in this room, whatever else happened. "It's nice to meet you." She looked at my hand for a long moment before taking it, her grip firmer than I expected. "Eric tells me you work in our building. Cleaning staff." I did. "I've been taking night classes alongside it. I'm hoping to study architecture eventually." "Hoping," she repeated, like the word itself was a kind of weakness, though something in her tone suggested she was testing me rather than dismissing me outright. "Eric has rejected 11 exceptionally qualified Omegas over the past 3 years. Omegas with family names, with educations already completed, with portfolios that would have strengthened this company's position in ways I don't need to explain to you. And now he tells me he intends to be with a young man who mops the floors of the lobby he walks through every morning." "Grandmother," Eric started, but she held up one hand, and he fell silent in a way that told me more about the family dynamics than anything either of them had said aloud. "I'm not finished," she said, and then turned her sharp attention fully back to me. "Tell me, Mr. Gill, what do you bring to this family? Specifically, not in feelings, which I'm sure are very genuine and very inconvenient. In substance." I felt the old, familiar instinct to make myself small, to apologize for taking up space in a room clearly designed to remind me I didn't belong in it. I thought about the chandelier, about my mother's warning, about a lifetime of being taught that wanting beautiful things was its own kind of foolishness for someone like me. And then I thought about Eric's face the first night, asking my name like it mattered. I thought about 3 months of a love built on actual conversation, actual presence, actual choice, instead of spreadsheets and strategic alliances. "I don't bring a portfolio," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I don't bring a family name that means anything outside the 2 districts I grew up in. What I bring is that I love your grandson for exactly who he is, not for what his name is worth, and I think, respectfully, that's worth more than anything the 11 Omegas before me were offering, because none of them seem to have stayed long enough to find out who he actually is underneath the company. I have. I know that he hates the color his family insists looks good on him in photographs. I know he feeds a stray cat outside his apartment that won't let him within 10 feet of it, but he keeps trying anyway. I know he sat in the back of a community college lecture hall in a baseball cap for 4 months because he wanted to support something that mattered to me, not to his portfolio. I can't give you numbers on a balance sheet, Mrs. Werner. I can tell you that your grandson is, for the first time in a long time, according to him, actually happy. I'd think that might be worth something to a family, even one as large as this." The room was silent long enough that I was certain I'd ruined everything, that I'd been too bold, too honest, too much exactly the unpolished thing she'd expected me to be. Eric's hand found mine on the couch cushion between us, gripping tight. Then, slowly, something shifted in the old woman's face. Not quite a smile, but an easing, the particular look of someone recalculating a problem they thought they'd already solved. "He fed a stray cat," she repeated, and there was something almost amused underneath the words now. "For 4 months, and it still won't let him near it." "He's very stubborn," I said, and beside me, Eric made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh. "Yes," she said, "I'm aware." She studied me a moment longer, and then sat back in her chair, some invisible tension leaving her shoulders. I am not going to pretend this is what I imagined for him. I built this company expecting it to pass to someone who understood it the way I do, strategically, structurally. But I have also watched my grandson reject 11 carefully chosen matches because none of them looked at him the way you just did, with something other than a calculator behind their eyes. That is not nothing, Mr. Gill. I am not promising you an easy road. The board will have opinions, the press will have more. But I am willing to find out whether you're as substantial as you sound rather than dismissing you before I do. It wasn't acceptance, not fully, not yet. But it was a door left open instead of slammed shut, and beside me, I felt Eric exhale like he'd been holding his breath for the entire conversation. Thank you, I said, and meant it. Don't thank me yet, she said, though the words had lost their earlier edge. Earn it. The months that followed weren't easy, exactly the way Eric's grandmother had warned. The board did have opinions loudly and often, and the press had even more, and there were nights I came home from my classes to find another article speculating about how long this would last, how soon Eric would tire of his lobby romance and return to the world of arranged introductions his family had built for him. There were relatives who never quite warmed to me, cousins at family gatherings who looked at me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. But there were other things too, things that mattered more in the end. Eric's grandmother started inviting me to tea alone, without Eric present, conversations that began as interrogations and slowly, over the following year, became something closer to genuine fondness, two people circling toward mutual respect. I finished my associate's degree and started the architecture program I'd shelved years before, and Eric sat in the audience at my small graduation ceremony with an expression of such open, unguarded pride that I had to look away or risk crying in front of everyone. I quit the cleaning job eventually, not because Eric asked me to, but because the new degree opened doors I'd never had access to before, and I took a junior position at a firm specializing in sustainable housing, work that felt like mine in a way nothing ever had before. But I never stopped walking past that lobby, never stopped glancing up at the chandelier my mother had warned me away from, and somewhere in that second year, I stopped flinching when I did. It was just light, scattered prettily across marble. It had never been a warning. It had only ever been beautiful, the way some things simply are, without needing to mean anything more than that. Eric proposed on the 1-year anniversary of the night. I first told him I loved him, not in some grand photograph spectacle his family's PR team would have preferred, but in the same diner booth where we'd eaten eggs at 4 in the morning, 100 times over the vinyl. Still sticky, the coffee still terrible. He didn't have a speech prepared. He just took my hand across the table, the same way he had that very first time, and told me that he'd spent 3 years rejecting every omega his family chose because some part of him had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who would choose him back. Not the company, not the name, just him, the man underneath all of it. The one who fed stray cats and loved an unglamorous shade of olive green and listened, really listened, when I talked about buildings I dreamed of designing someday. I said yes before he'd even finished asking, and the elderly waitress who'd served us more late-night breakfasts than either of us could count cried harder than either of us did, and brought us a slice of pie on the house, and told everyone in the diner that the boy who used to come in covered in cleaning supplies had finally landed his rich man. And Eric laughed so hard he nearly knocked over his coffee, and I thought watching him that I had never in my life imagined a love story for myself that looked anything like this, unglamorous, imperfect. Built out of stubborn cats and community college lecture halls, and a chandelier I'd been taught not to look up at for too long. We were married the following spring, in a ceremony his grandmother helped plan with a level of enthusiasm that surprised everyone who'd witnessed our first tense meeting in that overly manicured sitting room. Priya was there, and old Marcus from security, and half my old cleaning crew, sitting in the same rows as board members and executives who'd once walked past me in the lobby without a flicker of recognition. I wore a suit that fit for once, And Eric wore the olive green he'd never told anyone he loved until me. And when I walked toward him down that aisle, I didn't feel like furniture, or like an invisible thing, or like someone who needed to make himself smaller to survive in rooms built for people grander than me. I felt simply like someone who was about to marry the man who had once asked my name like it mattered in an empty lobby at 11 o'clock on an ordinary Thursday night and had never once, in all the time since, made me feel like it didn't. Sometimes, late at night, when neither of us can sleep, we still drive to that same diner, order the same eggs, sit in the same sticky booth, and sometimes, walking through the Werner lobby together on our way to dinner with his family, I let myself look up at that chandelier for longer than a second, longer than my mother ever warned me to. I let the light scatter across both of us equally, the way it always should have, the way nothing in my life had ever taught me to expect. Until the night a man with tired eyes and an empty schedule decided that a boy mopping the floor was worth stopping for. He was right to stop. I've spent every day since being grateful that he did. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.